Okay, thank you everybody for joining us today. This is the Top Step webinar for financial management reporting and metrics for predictive accuracy. My name is Jimmy Morales. I'm one of the consultants over here at Top Step, and this is all part of our OpenAir webinar series. So today, from that financials management reporting perspective, we're going to look at some best practices, some modeling of your organization's behavior with a key objective in mind. The objective being to be able to predict where you are going based on where you have been and drive to where you want to be. So this is kind of our mission statement of what we want to accomplish in this module today. And so when we're looking at that, these are going to be primarily focused on some best practices from within professional services organizations and departments within larger organizations that have sub-professional services departments. So when it comes to delivering and achieving within professional service orgs and departments, they're comprised generally of three key assets. So the three things that we want to keep in mind when we're trying to come up with the appropriate measures, again, to be able to make accurate predictions to drive where we want to be, are people, service offerings, and earnings. And I don't need to go into descriptions on what these are. Most of you already know, but we'll go into how these three key assets can be fulfilled through better reporting. So basically enablement within these three key assets. So when it comes to professional services, whether it's organizational or departmental, successful organizations that we've seen across a multitude of different kinds of organizations that typically have these four elements when it comes to financial reporting. They're measured, meaning they're numeric in nature. The types of information that they're collecting not only is quick and consumable, but it's meaningful, it's goal-oriented, and they're realistic. Some of this might be some back to basics for some of you, and some of it may be start of part of your everyday, your day to day. But these are kind of lost key measures of success. Are these four? They're also trending, meaning that their reporting and key information points are time driven. They're reasonably directional. And that you ought to be able to make predictions, meaning that they are predictive. They use those trends and the trending historical measurements, and they should be able to reasonably make predictions for what's ahead or what's down the road. If your information is scattered all over the place, you may need to look at different kinds of measurements to fulfill these four elements here. And then finally, they're proactive. Meaning they're decision focused and they're forward looking. So we're going to be looking at these, some different kinds of reports and different kinds of charts and dashboards, the kind of information that is quickly consumable, whether it's a business analyst or an executive, and seeing how they kind of fulfill these four, as I'm calling them, the back to basics of these. And so that's all part and parcel of establishing KPIs or key performance indicators to support the success of your organization. KPIs have a tendency to become part of the mundane, part of the buzzword culture in different organizations. So they get left behind often because one, they're either not looked at frequently enough, or two, they're not ingrained into the company culture. And they're not captured in the dashboards, graphs, and your everyday reporting to make them front and center. And so some of what we're going to look at are some examples of some financial graphical expressions of how we're going to, again, go back to predicting where you're going and driving where you want to be based on where you have been. So let's start with where you have been. This is a chart, a good uh, realization or achievement of the target bill rate chart over time. So this is a wonderful representation of those four elements of successful organizations, right? It's measured, it's trending, it's predictive, and it's proactive. So this represents week over week, over a period of time or a year, of the percentage of the target bill rate realization. So how well are we achieving our target bill rate? And you can see week over week, we are slowly and steadily declining, right? So this should be an indicator of change, to be proactive in the future. So let's look at those four elements of successful orgs, right? Is it measured? Well, it's percentage based, so it's numeric in nature. It's realistic. It gives us it fulfills all the attributes of a good measured um, chart. So weekly periods, the numbers are meaningful to us. So you want to obviously have numbers that relate or correlate to KPIs almost directly in some aspects. It's trending, so it's designed for fast information, it's consumable, and it's something that is really quick where it's part of a dashboard that doesn't necessarily feel cluttered when you first log into a system or an environment or a dashboard utility. It's predictive, so it should be obvious that if we do nothing in this example, status quo week 18 is going to result in zero or no or near zero realization. So how can this help us be more proactive? Well, we should have seen this by our seventh or eighth week, that we ought to dive deeper into either analysis, know what's driving our bill rates down, or make even macro level decisions to kind of shift our efforts to achieve that target bill rate if this is a key performance indicator or a key measurable. And so this might be an example of something that is a little bit more historical, again, where you've been, but you might be able to have something that's where you've been and where you are, um, on like an 8 week period. So 8 week periods are very good for this kind of thing. So realization achievement of target bill rate is a wonderful example. Let's look at another example. You've got average bill rates. Now these two graphs represent bill rates and your invoice hour rates, and they're considering non-billable and travel and admin time. So how does this fulfill those four elements? Well, it's measured again. It averages, it's measuring averages. It's fast information. It's absolutely critical when you're looking at graphical or higher level information, that it's fast and it's consumable, like I've mentioned before. In this example, we've got 2-on-1 screen, so you've got a great comparative analysis. So you might have a KPI that's not necessarily these two individual items, but these two items kind of either overlaid or something that is comparable to one another. And this is, again, trending. You can see that this ought to give us some kind of idea of what to expect. We ought to be able to see directly from this that they're not inversely or directly correlated, right? You can see in the beginning months that our bill rate goes down and our invoice rate goes down. We've got a couple dips and highs and lows going into the future with our bill rates that don't necessarily marry out to our invoiced hour rates. So it's predictive in that it may give us insight into seasonality of our business. And so we can make better decisions to say, well, just because our invoice rate hours are down, our bill rate doesn't necessarily need to go up to accommodate for it. So a good indicator of it's not always about the bottom line dollar value of the service offerings. And so these kinds of things can help you make more proactive decisions, um, so that you're not so reactive in saying, well, our bill rates are going down, our invoice rates are going down, let's raise our prices, right? You might end up putting yourself into poor high level decisions by not seeing this information, say, daily. So it's a good recommendation to have something front and center like that. Here's another one. This is a very simple high-level dashboard chart. It gives us insight into as to how our business is doing in a general sense. It's a good example of basic overlooked reporting metric that fits into the criteria of measured, trending, predictive, and proactive elements. So while revenue by year is something that might seem obvious to some, it's a great call to action to maybe bring things back to that high level view, front and center type of reporting, and maybe a back to basics for some of you. Looking again, so we were looking at some of these of where you've been, where you're going again, the idea being, is it trending and is it predictive, and can you make those proactive decisions? Well, this is a trending and forecasted margin by type of project. So if you, now type of project might be something that you have classified or segregated your different project types in your organization, but simplifying it to be digested as quickly as possible is critical to making high level and low level decisions. So in this example, we're forecasted to decline in margin in several key service offerings or project types or product types. And it's clear that we need to make some kind of adjustment. Now, obviously, these bars are kind of misrepresented in terms of like bar height, but you can see here that some service offerings are yielding lower value in the forecast for last year compared to this year. So at a high level, we might want to quickly shift efforts into more of our bread and butter products. Or at a low level, we might take a look at this and say, well, this is kind of a red flag. We might need to drill down into certain kind of product types or project types to look at either our pricing model, our sales pipeline, or to see what kind of revenue we're anticipating over the next year and what's driving that. So a great high level snapshot that should give you, in a snap type of decisions on whether or not to dive into a deeper analysis to get more information. Looking at another example of where you're going, this is a great example of a report for forecasting over the next 6 months, comparing. This is a stacked chart, one of the better used for functions like this, where you're comparing the combination of your backlog forecast and your pipeline forecast. So you can kind of see things start to level out over time. It's a great example of the gradual fulfillment of services over time. And this allows us to quickly see the balance between your pipeline and your backlog revenue. So this is looking at just two specific metrics. It's very simple, but they're critical to indicate, there can be more opportunities for, say, and this is just an example, recurring revenue versus non-recurring revenue. And you can maybe see something not be so dramatic over time with 6 months, and you have a little bit more stable revenue estimates in the future. Again, this is more on the future outlook side of things, where you're going. So here's a good example of a healthy growth model that you might have. So this is a capacity versus target measurement. So this might help you measure your staffing needs to accommodate your target revenue. So you should be able to anticipate a growth model or build out information of how your business is growing and how your employee resources are growing, and whether or not you're invoicing at that rate. I mean, if you're really starting to see these two overlap or exceed or bridge the gap between one another, you might want to look into either proactively recruiting or allocate resources to prevent things like burnout. So this is a great model for maintaining your resources versus your growth model. Another one, forecasting where you want to be. So forecasting versus your forecast versus your budget. So where are you headed as far as your prospects and your client information? And what's your budget, your internal growth model? How do you anticipate growing based on your increasing budgets every year, the number of projects that you have scheduled for closure in your pipeline for looking at annual recurring revenue or your non-recurring revenue, combining those and saying, what can we anticipate in 2 years from now? And this is great for creating baselines and benchmarks. Might seem like a given, but I've seen a lot of opportunities in different organizations who fail to model growth into their forecasts. So it's a good example of focusing efforts between pre-sales and organic growth to meet those goals and allow you to make, in some cases, more lofty goals that are still realistic and attainable. So key performance indicators. Some of the most common KPIs include utilization. And this is again more professional services driven or organizations departments driven. So utilization, how well are your employees using their time and resources? And then creating again those four elements within your financial management reporting to look at this particular KPI. Compliance, are they putting their say timesheets in on time? Are invoices getting approved on time? What kind of things are impacting your actualization or your realization? Um, Backlog versus forecast, we actually saw an example of that. Project margin, what's your profitability per project? If it's low profitability, how can you increase your volume? If it's high profitability, how can you allocate your resources effectively to maximize the amount that you can put into each project? Capacity versus demand, we saw an example of that. Um, Revenue by professional service resource. This is a little bit more granular, but it might give you more insight onto the employee, the effectiveness of your people. And I won't go through every single one of these, but you've got, quite a few here, as you can see. And you want them in terms of best practices across the professional service world to generally fall within uh, the three key assets that we talked about in the beginning. So this is kind of trying to tie these together across those examples that we saw. So you've got your people, your service offerings, and your earnings. So whatever you do when you're looking at building a KPI and building reporting off of it, especially daily or monthly or weekly review type reporting, is organizing them to where they fit within these key assets. And so what may make sense to you is coming up with a chart something like this. So what I recommend is for those of you that are joining that are new to whether it's the industry or the tools that you're using, you're business analyst and you're trying to sharpen your teeth on some of this, or if you're even at the executive level and you're trying to look at a back to basics kind of approach to really get that focus back on your KPIs and get the adoption across your organization, take a screenshot of this and get kind of an idea of how these different types of reports, these are just titles of reports, fit within these four key elements of success, right? So how well do your people type reportings or KPIs fit into measured, trending, predictive, and proactive elements? And again, these are consistently across the successful examples of different organizations out there. So when it comes to, say, building these from scratch, or again, going back to basics and kind of rewriting some of the KPIs and measurement style reporting from the ground up, we want to review the actuals and we want to ask a couple of questions. So before we jump into what we think might be the problem, if we're trying to attack a particular opportunity in an organization, or we want to discover what those are, begin with reviewing your current services earnings. So what services are driving your earnings? As I mentioned earlier, what if you need or you have hints that you might need to focus on the bread and butter of your organization or expand to new platforms, find out what they are and what type of resources are driving those earnings. So how can you better allocate those resources effectively to really drive those key areas? And this is really ultimately going to maximize profit margin and bottom line. So review your offerings. So when you're building out these opportunities, what was quoted versus what was delivered? We saw an example of that earlier on a report. Think of target bill rate versus your actual invoiced rate. So we saw they weren't necessarily correlated. So we might be thinking, hey, we're discounting too much. We may need to take a closer look at that. What type of resources are staffed to the project? So are we allocating our resources effectively? Do we have appropriate skill set profiles for our team from a professional services perspective to where we're not managing our costs effectively? So a great example is Um, Obviously, having over-certified individuals or overqualified individuals on projects that could probably afford to have less experienced or not necessarily as certified different types of resources. And that means reviewing your resources effectively. So where is time being spent? A lot of organizations will look at the billable components. Some organizations, and these are two different kinds, so it's whatever suits the needs of the individual organization, but utilization or productivity. So how well is their time being spent when it is not billable, or what level of billable. Um, uh, some of them use what's like a multiplier or an effectiveness of the billable measurement. And so how well are they doing on that regard? So you can kind of granularize that and get some more information there. What are the skills among them? So again, do you have an appropriate log or resource base to be able to allocate resources effectively based on their skill sets, language proficiencies, certifications, and so on? So once you have those questions, maybe you have the answers, then what? Well, you want to establish a base set of KPIs that can be measured regularly. So again, these aren't arbitrary KPIs. They can do that over time with some organizations because again, it's kind of we went through a period where there was a trendiness, I guess you could say, with the buzz around key performance indicators, and a lot of organizations tried to implement it, and what they failed to do was measure them regularly and eh, cultivate a culture that not only adopts it but looks at it and cares about it. So having that impact on from top to bottom across the resource pool. Invest in technology to aid in measures, so such as a PSA tool. So again, if you don't know necessarily what your skill sets are from your resource team or how well they're using their time or have measurement capabilities for those sample graphs that I had mentioned, then you might not have the PSA tool that actually even captures that. Or if you have a kind of a convoluted or almost incoherent grid of skill sets, that might not make for effective resource pooling. Commit to a cadence to review KPIs regularly. This is a good example of something back to basics, but is often overlooked. How often are your resources and department leaders looking at these numbers that are valuable to you, and are they valuable to them? Can you put it in front of them daily or weekly or monthly? Will just placing it in front of them make them care about it, or will there be different incentives or disincentives that can help kind of boost the morale in that regard? Take actions and ask questions based on measures. So when you see these measurements, a lot of what you have seen when I had gone through some of these examples is the solution isn't always making that macro level change or making micro level changes. It may begin with just making the decision to dive deeper and get more information. Diving deeper can mean getting into your resource pool and asking what's the lay of the land for them, or it can be going into detailed reporting that gives you the very specifics of each of these metrics. So this is kind of that high level overview. It's not really going into the granular detail of some of these financial reportings, but it's good examples of kind of a call to action to get back to basics, especially with regards to getting those KPIs, making sure they meet those three key assets: people, service offerings, and your earnings, and whether or not your measurements are measured, they're trending, they're predictive, and they help you be proactive. So with that said, if you do want to know more about this particular topic or other topics similar to it, as far as best practices and other organizations, we recommend going to our website, which is topstepllc.com. You can you'll be able to see this within, I believe, the next week, this particular webinar, and you can download it. Follow our tweets at Top Step Tweets. You can join our LinkedIn group, OpenAir Users, which is great for insight on key one-off types of questions as well. Thank you all for your time today.